Thank you very much, Professor Wright. I would like to thank Biola University and in particular the Torrey Honors Program, who have been my gracious hosts all day, and also all of you for coming out this evening. I was glad to hear that a purpose of these lectures is to challenge and expand, because I think that some of the ideas I'm going to suggest tonight might do that. Although I don't know you well as an audience, so I've tried to make sure to leave time in this for questions and answers at the end. So keep in mind, let those questions stir in your head. I would love to hear them to the extent that we have time. So tonight I'd like to talk about some of the reasons why I think Christians and Muslims would do well to collaborate in support of religious freedom. I'd like you to think about this tonight, perhaps a bit like watching an ice hockey match. If you're not an ice hockey fan, you're missing out. It's one of my favorite sports, in which a brawl has broken out on the ice. Because when we think about Islam in the world today and Christian-Muslim relations, we often think about a great deal of violence. And what I'm going to do is recognize that brawl and the conflict are there, and I'm going to seize the offensive and skate past it and go for the goal on the other side. So I'm aware that the conflicts and tension are there, but there's more to the story. I approach this topic both as a Christian myself and as a scholar who has spent more than 25 years studying Islam. And in the past few years, a major focus of my research has been reading what Muslims themselves have to say about religious freedom. God wants human beings to know and love their Creator and to flourish in peaceful human society. I believe this deeply. Religious freedom helps to make both possible. If you are unfamiliar with Muslim support for religious freedom and perhaps even think, no way, that's impossible, I encourage you to set aside the word impossible. After all, if you're unfamiliar with this, then how do you know? Being unfamiliar with something is an invitation to learn, and in this case, an invitation to learn something new about Islam and Muslims. So if you would like to learn more about what Muslims have to say about religious freedom, since that's not going to be the main focus of my talk, these cards are available for you on the table at the exit, and they will take you to a website called islamandreligiousfreedom.org, which makes available media by Muslims themselves in text, video, and audio to learn what Muslims themselves have to say. I recognize that not all Muslims in the world support religious freedom. Islam is a religion of 1.6 billion followers, living in a wide range of political conditions and vastly diverse cultural situations. Within this 1.6 billion, there is a segment of Muslims, both Sunni and Shia, who support allowing individuals the freedom to come to authentic belief without coercion, and allowing members of society to pursue and practice their faith for Muslims and non-Muslims. And so we arrive at task number 1 tonight for Christian-Muslim partnerships to support religious freedom. And yes, I said task, there's going to be a little bit of homework tonight, but just a little. We as Christians and Muslims need to take time to learn about each other. And my point tonight is that to the extent there are Muslims who support religious freedom, we as Christians should work together with them as partners for the common good. And a core part of this will be supporting religious freedom. So next I would like to discuss why I think that Christians and Muslims should work together as partners to support and spread religious freedom. For one thing, there's a pragmatic imperative. Christians and Muslims together make up nearly half of the world's population. So what we do stands to have a global impact. Certainly partnerships with believers of other faiths and those of no faith are valuable and important too. But Christians and Muslims together stand uniquely poised to have a global impact. And alongside this, I want to discuss 4 particular areas, and I have named these meaning, marriage, martyrdom, and missions. And I'm sorry we didn't bring M&Ms tonight for snack. The first is meaning. What is a meaningful life? Christians and Muslims alike place a premium on this question. And it's important here that religious freedom is not just a way for us to put up with each other in society. Yes, the golden rule is relevant to religious freedom, but I view it only as the starting point. And Jesus tells us in Matthew 7:12, "In everything, therefore, treat people the same way you want them to treat you, for this is the law and the prophets." So this is a great start. And one way I think to understand this is extend to others the religious freedom you would like them to extend to you. But at a deeper level, each of my fellow human beings on this planet, each of my neighbors was made in the image of God, created by and for truth. Supporting religious freedom is a way of fostering environments in which others, my neighbors, can seek truth. So as a Christian, I see making it possible for my neighbor to seek truth as a form of loving my neighbor. And in 1 Thessalonians 5:15, we read, "Always seek after that which is good for one another and for all people." And in Jeremiah 29:7, God tells the Israelites, "Seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf. For in its welfare, you will have welfare." I consider the possibility of truth-seeking to be one of the greatest goods I can seek for another person, and a cornerstone of human welfare. Our next area of common ground is marriage. In moving from meaning to marriage, we move from securing a world safe for seeking meaning to questions of being a person of faith and how we live out our faith in the world. This issue of marriage is of particular importance right now in our local American context. The mainstream Christian and Muslim traditions view marriage as a permanent, if possible, union of one man and one woman. In the tremendous diversity of American society today, this is now just one view among many about what marriage is, and whether something called marriage, whatever that may be, is even relevant. And this is a relatively recent change in the status of marriage and the dissolution of cultural agreement about what marriage is. This is going to have far-reaching implications for both individual religious believers as well as religious institutions in our society. Those of us with shared concern for man-woman marriage would do well to work as partners. We will need to remain actively engaged to assure the structures of our society continue to allow our religious institutions to function in accordance with our beliefs and allow us as individuals to live according to conscience. Let us as Muslims and Christians together think about each other's houses of worship and the rights of religious communities to govern their own affairs. Let us think about each other's 5-year-old children and what they are learning at school. Let us think about the talents each other brings to the public square. We should seek to protect the rights of individuals to participate in the public square with, not in spite of, their varied religious beliefs. This is an imperative both of justice as well as practical import. Consider the tremendous talent pool American Muslims are in our society. American Muslims are statistically more educated and more well off than the American population at large. The American Muslim community is packed with medical doctors, engineers, entrepreneurs, artists, educators, and others who serve the public good with their talents. I do not want to see this talent, or the talent of any other religious believers, shut out of contributing to our society the way, for example, Brendan Ike was shut out of Mozilla. Before leaving the topic of marriage, I feel I need to make a quick diversion to caution my fellow Christians not to make a mountain out of a molehill on the issue of polygamy. When I have raised this issue of collaborating to support marriage in society in the past with Christians, I have quickly found the, "Hey, what about polygamy?" comes up before we can even have a discussion. So that's why I'm going to talk about it now. Relative to the issue of marriage itself, the particular issue of polygamy should not be an absolute barrier to Christian-Muslim collaboration, supporting a pro-marriage culture in our society. For one thing, many Muslims oppose polygamy on religious reasons, such as the injunction in the Quran that a man should not marry more than one woman if he cannot treat each equally, something which many Muslims consider impossible given the nature of love itself. Second, the only passage in the Quran that mentions polygamy, the opening of chapter 4 of the Quran, is specifically about protection of orphans and widows. This is anything but a free pass for male licentiousness. So if you haven't read the opening of chapter 4, I encourage you to do so. It's easy to access online at Quran.com. Third, while those Muslims who would allow polygamy and Christians do face a deep difference, at the same time, there's actually at least somewhat of a commonality in this, I think, and we're sometimes too quick to overlook it. Namely, the Muslim understanding is fundamentally that a marriage is between one man and one woman. There are certain cases where some Muslims will allow that a man can marry one woman more than once, but this is fundamentally different concept of what the body is, of what sexual relations are, than by contrast what we see today in polyamory, for example. And so male-female complementarity and the possibility of a union resulting in children do remain at the core of how Muslims understand marriage. So I disagree with polygamy, and I think there are secular arguments for why the state has an interest in not allowing it. But again, this is a relatively narrow, specialized issue, and as such, we should not let it stand in the way of collaboration for shared values of sexual integrity and a marriage-friendly, family-friendly culture and society. My third area I'd like to touch on is martyrdom. Religious freedom, or its absence, is a life or death issue. ISIS is murdering Christians and other minorities. At the same time, ISIS and other violent Islamist groups are killing thousands and thousands of Muslims who reject the extremist interpretations of these marginal violent factions. In other areas of the world, such as the Central African Republic, Christians have been burning mosques and actually in some areas trying to eliminate Muslim populations. It is imperative that we find ways to live together with our deepest differences. My neighbor made in God's image was not created for slaughter. Religious freedom is not only about structures of state neutrality toward religion. It is also about building cultures in which the dominant method for handling disagreement is to try to have a better argument than your disagreeing neighbor has, instead of seeking political control to try to crush your neighbor. And in this environment of trying to have a better argument, there may also be times in a structure of religious freedom in which we agree to disagree. Such a culture is diametrically opposed to the obsession of groups like ISIS that seek political control through violence in order to force compliance from others. So religious freedom also needs to be considered as something that can contribute to countering violent extremism. And this is related to seeking the peace of the city, fostering environments where there is collaboration for the common good, not martyrdom. The last of the four areas I would like to address is missions. Christianity is a proselytizing religion. Islam is a proselytizing religion. I think we need to be frank about these discussions and comfortable with them. These are core parts of our religions. Seeking allowance to proselytize comes hand in hand with allowing others to proselytize. This is a two-way street. By contrast, a mentality of, quote, freedom for me but not for thee, unquote, is just a recipe for violent conflict. When we partner with each other to support religious freedom, missions will be part of this. Which brings me back to meaning. This is fundamentally about enabling environments for truth-seeking in a true, authentic, and free manner. Christians and Muslims disagree in some significant ways about the meaning and purpose of our respective missions, but we agree that seeking meaning is intrinsic to what makes us human. We have each, in his or her own way, experienced faith as a deep good and as something to share, not something to hide under a rock. As the world's two largest religions that are by nature proselytizing faiths, Christians and Muslims who support religious freedom understand that religious freedom is about allowing room for difference. And if we stand for allowing this room for difference together, I think we could make a tremendous public witness. And a partnership of Christians and Muslims would also stand as a witness to the possibility of peace in tremendously diverse societies. And in a day and age of globalization, diversity in societies is a norm with which we live, no longer an exception. We need to go beyond just decrying persecution of our own co-religionists. This isn't a soccer match of my team versus their team. Religious persecution and religious freedom are fundamentally human issues. So your homework then. I suggest beginning with prayer. This is about our individual relationship with God and how we together choose to live out how we understand that. Next, as I mentioned before, take time to learn about each other. If you are unfamiliar with what Muslims themselves have to say, we need to take time to read, listen, and watch. And not just to the pundits. We need to go deeper than that. And take time to get to know each other in person. If there are any of you here who have never met and don't have a personal social connection with a Muslim, I see two people in the room at least that I can tap into to assist with that, who are local here in your own area. This is extremely important. Seriously, come see me afterwards and I'm gonna come chase down the allies I know in the room to help. In conclusion, if we want to foster a world in which there is room for meaning and purpose, in which we can bear witness to what our faiths teach us about, for example, what marriage is, in which we can live with deep difference instead of live with the news of martyrs, and lastly, in which we have the freedom to witness to faith, as Christians call their mission, or to invite to faith, as Muslims call their missions, we would do well to work together as partners. Thank you, and I invite your questions. And by the way, I'll just mention that this microphone that captures the sound in the room is not connected to the camera, and so they've asked that I repeat your question so that that gets captured for the camera. So that's why I'll be trying to repeat your questions. And don't be shy.
Part of the line of reasoning that you're putting forth seems to be kind of the logic of not necessarily the enemy of my enemy is my friend, but more of that there's a larger third party that we seem to be combating in terms of ideology in say the modernized Western world, and that Muslims would be our greatest ally in combating this third party that we both have in opposition to us. Is that a good characterization of at least part of the logic that you're putting forward?
I wouldn't, maybe I wouldn't go so far as to put it in terms of enemy, but I do think on some very important issues of values in society, of questions especially of family, moral values, that there is a commonality of shared values that are quite different from and at times in opposition to some of the secular norms culturally. Is there somebody else? No? Okay, go for it.
Sorry, just to follow up to that. So then would your advice necessarily only be applicable to those areas of the world wherever that plurality exists and not the duality, say, like in Nigeria, wherever the majority of the population is split either between Muslim or Christian, and not really a larger third secular entity?
Good question. No, I would say that what I've talked about really applies globally. Because as I started with at the beginning and ended with, the most important, I think, of all the reasons as to why we would collaborate to assure structures of religious freedom is because seeking meaning is so fundamentally important. And that is true across environments. But by the way, since you brought up Nigeria, I will point out that there is actually some very interesting Christian-Muslim collaboration in Nigeria on supporting marriage at a time when a lot of Western aid comes with requirements to assert certain sexual values that a lot of Christians and Muslims object to. So this is happening in areas also outside the US.
I think as someone growing up in a Muslim culture, like a lot of what you're saying is like really like resonating with me. And I really would agree, like there are a lot of issues that I think Christians don't realize that they definitely do have in common with Muslims. But I wonder if some of the issues that you state as like similarities are actually like irreconcilable differences. Like I think a huge thing in the church nowadays is like this struggle to like treat homosexuals with like love. Like this whole like marriage issue is like a like, you know, making sure that like they know that they are not like accepted, but there's not any hatred towards them. We're like not talking about like the text so much, but in every Muslim country that I know of, there's never that kind of struggle. And I've seen like, you know, photos, like horrific things that are done to homosexuals in Muslim countries, and like this idea of marriage, just the gender bias of every Muslim country that I visited, that it's not so much of like a promotion of marriage because the Bible says that like, you know, men and women complete each other and like it's this equal relationship. In the Muslim text, like it talks about like promotion of like punishing your women and like don't hit her face because like that's where her glory comes from. Like it's an inherent like difference in our theologies that even though like we might have this surface of like we think marriage is important or we think, you know, like I don't know, the stuff that you list are ideas of like proselytization. I think like yes, like Christians want there to be more Christians, Muslims want there to be more Muslims, but there's an inherent difference of like Christians want there to be more Christians in my mind for a very different reason, whereas like the idea of Islam, like when you look at the reality of like what happened, of like the kind of like, I don't know, obviously like Christianity can result in like a violence and like you have the Crusades and you have that thing that we also did as Christians. I don't know, I guess I just like really worry that you're understating, because in my view as a Christian, Islam is a lie. And so I think that like that's something that like can't be ignored, and I think that there are like irreconcilable differences that cause like extreme hurt and extreme like loss.
Okay, so I identified 3 main issues in there, and I'm going to try to tackle them 1, 2, 3. The first is on how we look at individuals in society, whether inside our faith communities or outside, who experience same-sex attraction. I think that the view that, if we look at Muslim countries, a phrase I want to question in a minute, there are also areas outside of the West where there are Christian communities who are engaged in violence against homosexuals. So this also can vary with cultural context. And there are Muslims present in almost every continent of the world, not just in countries that are Muslim majority. There are more Muslims in China than there are in Syria. There are millions of Muslims here in the United States. So when we talk about Muslims in the world, it's not just in environments where there are countries where the population is a majority. And in some cultural contexts, I have been watching Muslims because I happen to know a lot of Muslims and I spend a lot of my time trying to listen to and understand what they're saying to each other. I have watched quite a few discussions of intra-Muslim discussion, trying to better understand how do we handle issues of complex sexual desire within our community? How do we treat each other lovingly? Next, on women, views of women and gender in Islam, this is a huge, huge, huge topic. I can't cover it all here. However, I would disagree that a Christian view talks about complementarity of man and woman, whereas, to paraphrase you, the Quran only talks about men harming women, because the Quranic view of marriage, as I understand it, and I invite any Muslims who are here to correct me, please, is that you will be a clothing for each other, a cover for each other. There is a mutual care that is expressed, that is central to what marriage is, and a mutuality and complementarity. So I don't think our understandings of marriage are actually all that different, and I would encourage you to keep reading on issues of women and gender in the Quran and how Muslims historically and today are working through this. Last, I want to talk about proselytization, which you asked about. And of course, we're proselytizing for different reasons. That's because we're different religions. We have some very basic different teachings, but the framework of religious freedom says that we can agree to disagree, and that we can allow each other freedom, and the societies which have opted for these structures are prone to be much less violent, because there's a renunciation of seeking political control, and there's an agreement of allowing political structures to be neutral. I do not see any way that we can make an argument for proselytization in which we allow ourselves but not others, because that gives others the right to allow themselves a right to proselytization but try to stop us. I don't see any way that we can logically do that. And quickly here, if any of the Muslims who are here want to jump in on my attempt to provide a quick overview on these huge issues of homosexuality as well as women, gender, and marriage, please know I invite you. So, and if there are more questions?
My question is a little bit related to the one earlier about us uniting against this third thing out there, with the secular views about marriage. And you talked about political structures and allowing political structures to be neutral. And that's something that I feel is we're trying to figure out in America, but the European option has been to make the political structures neutral by making them secular, which isn't exactly neutral. So I'm wondering, what kind of collaboration are you proposing, and how would that also allow political structures to be neutral to those who are secular?
I think that all right, I'm biased here, I'm an American, but I do think that the American structure of religious freedom has allowed religious freedom for believers and non-believers. As for what some of this collaboration might look like, one of the best examples I can think of is the Becket Fund for Religious Freedom. If any of you are interested in religious freedom and have even the slightest inkling of going to law school, you need to know what the Becket Fund is. The Becket Fund is a law firm with lawyers across religious faiths who partner together in defending religious freedom for each other. This is an American law firm, but they also take on a lot of international cases nowadays. And Americans have also been very active. Americans of multiple faiths have been active, for example, in the situation, one of them that's of interest to me is the question of women's religious garb in international sports. So can, for example, women wear a headscarf with a soccer uniform at international level soccer competitions? And the European response to this initially and the Canadian responses to this were no, because we need to keep religion out of the public sphere. I think it's been exciting to see Americans from a variety of religious backgrounds chiming in on this issue, saying we want to allow individuals to participate in society fully as who they are. We don't want to ask them to leave a part of themselves at the door when they go to the public square. And so with international soccer, Americans have been one part of the group of influential voices in helping to get FIFA to reverse its ruling on women being allowed to wear headscarves in international sports competitions. And Americans have been a real witness of, we allow this here, we allow Sikhs, we allow Jews, we allow others, we allow Catholic nuns, to wear a habit in public, we allow those of Christians traditions where the priests and pastors may have religious garb to wear their religious attire in public. So those are some of the practical examples of partnering together and ways that I think our American experience of finding a way to make this work can have an influence elsewhere. Did you have a question? No? Okay.
What are some other practical ways of reinforcing points of commonality without degrading or losing differing points that we or Muslims hold dear?
I think one of the most important ways to do that is by getting to know each other, because through that we can learn what is important to the other, and thus be more sensitive to be careful that something to us that may not be important, that we might sweep under the rug and say, oh yeah, look, we all agree, is actually very important to somebody else. And on the issue of interfaith dialogue, what has often become branded as interfaith dialogue, there are those for whom it's very meaningful and important, and I'm happy those contacts and discussions happen. I will say that personally, I actually am not usually one to participate. I don't like to participate in forums where there's sort of a lowest common denominator, where people are asked to leave anything that might be disagreement at the door. I think that having discussions with strangers where the first thing we talk about is our religion is a mistake, because you're asking people to talk about something near and dear to them and complex, and fit it into a nutshell and tell it in public. I really think that we do well to have our starting points of contact, for example, in Christian-Muslim relations, be maybe an area of shared interest. So for example, I used to work at the Witherspoon Institute in Princeton, and the very first time that we did a partnership there where we invited Muslims to partner with us was not to say, hey, let's talk about Islam and Christianity. Instead, it was a project called The Social Costs of Pornography, in which we brought together researchers in neuroscience, psychiatry, psychology, social work to help make more publicly available research that's going on about what will the costs be to society of allowing pornography to be more widely available. Now, the individuals who were most concerned about this question were religious believers. And it was a team of Jews, Muslims, and Christians together who helped make this happen, and who also contributed, in addition to the academic research, to looking at the impact of pornography on the human person, on the soul. And that experience of partnering together with Muslims in this led some of the Christians who participated, who had never met Muslims before, who were a little leery, who had only heard things in the news, to meet people in person, discover, wow, this person has a lot to contribute to this discussion, and then take the relationship a little bit further. So I encourage starting on points of shared interest and concern, and realizing that getting to know each other and getting to know each other's religious faith may be one of the last things that happens, and that needs to be a long-term investment. That's not going to happen overnight on one panel. Go, red shirt.
to give another specific example, how would you understand many scholars and apologists that like to publicize debates of particular doctrines that Islamic scholars and apologists will respond to, those kinds of debates that they have? Would you say that's seeking meaning or causing more division that's unnecessary?
There are those who leave with me the impression that they view their primary purpose as trying to make Muslims look like an entire class of people we should look down on, as if their entire purpose is some kind of perhaps self-identity of wanting to give themselves a pat on the back. When I see that, I'm concerned. I also think it's difficult today. It's exciting that we have so many different media outlets available and so much information, but it also means that you have to do more work to really separate really substantive information-based inquiry from political punditry. So be critical of the sources you read. And again, listen to what Muslims themselves have to say about their own faith.
So it's kind of a two-part question, but this idea of loving others and doing unto others, which is definitely biblical, and Jesus talks about, how would you say we can reconcile that with other things that Jesus says? For example, if you love me, the world will hate you, and I did not come to bring peace to the world, but to bring a sword. How would you say those two ideas go together? And then further, we're called to fix our minds on things above and preach the gospel. How does peaceful relationships on earth, not that those aren't valuable, affect eternal things?
So on, let's see now, on the first question, so your first question was, can you repeat that?
Yeah, how do we reconcile Jesus saying, love others, do unto others, but also the world will hate you?
Okay. I think proposing to partner on religious freedom doesn't mean that we agree on everything. The basic premise of religious freedom, it came into existence because of very deep and violent disagreements. It isn't premised on a form of love thy neighbor, which is just lollipops, butterflies, and fields of flowers. Instead, saying that we should partner for religious freedom out of a view of love thy neighbor recognizes this is going to be difficult. And also, where I talked about meaning as I think the first cornerstone of this, and fostering environments where there can be truth-seeking as a form of love thy neighbor, I think that gets at some of the deepest levels of who Jesus was and whether or not people can come to know the gospel. And also, I view this act of loving my neighbor by wanting my neighbor to have a free environment to come to know and love God authentically. I view that as a form of sharing the gospel. I believe my neighbor is created in the image of God to the extent that I want to allow them the freedom to come to know God, that is more important to me than some short-term worldly gain.
Alongside trying to have a better factual understanding of Islam, do you have any recommendations of Muslim art or art about Muslims that would help us empathize more with them and also understand their culture?
I love this. Now, you mentioned at the end their culture. I would like to push back a little and say Islam is a religion, not a culture, and there are many, many, many different cultures in which there are Muslims. Wow, I don't even know where to start with that.
Qawwali, Pakistani music tradition.
Yeah, it's spelled with a Q, for any of you taking notes. And certainly Islamic calligraphy And by the way, the calligraphy on the green sign over there that's on the back of these little cards was done by an American Muslim in Princeton, New Jersey. I think also architecture and the diversity and richness of especially mosque architecture. I mean, these are places of prayer. Wow, there's fortunately, there's so much I don't know where to start, but you are definitely barking up the right tree. Anybody else? Oh, okay, way in the back, yes.
Staff member Steve?
Yeah.
I just want to give the young students an advice from an older Christian. Know your Christianity. Get a good foundation, knowing Scripture, having a close relationship with the Lord, and you will love people. You would have to, because you have Jesus in you, and you love everyone. But make sure that you know what you believe and who you believe. And then you can go and then look up other religions and all and compare them and be able to relate to people of other religions.
Go ahead.
Well, I wanted to make a comment.
Okay, please. And I also am going to take a quick moment here to introduce a guest I think we're really honored to have. This is Dr. Munir Sheikh from Bayan Islamic graduate Claremont, Bayan Claremont Islamic Graduate School, which is a neighbor of yours here.
Hi everyone, it's great to be here. I've never been on the campus of Biola, although having grown up here in Southern California, I've always heard the name, and I actually don't live too far from here. And it's nice to make your acquaintance and kind of get an understanding of the context that you have here for learning about your faith and the education that you're getting to be active in the world. I just wanted to say or provide a little bit of additional information from the Quran, sort of a scriptural perspective, which is of course distinct from what we may observe in the world, sociologically or culturally or otherwise, right? All these different places in the world where different dynamics of economics are operating in politics and so forth. But just from a scriptural standpoint, the Quran does talk about Christians and Jews in particular as people who've received revelation from God. And Muslims believe that, the God of Muhammad is the God of Abraham. And Abraham, of course, is the father figure for Jews, Christians, and Muslims. But the scriptural point that I wanted to share with you was that, so Muslims also have to think about their place in the world and how do they relate to these other communities. And the Quranic text says that Muslims should see themselves as striving in good works or striving in competition to accomplish good works with particularly Christians and Jews. So it's not about creating an adversarial relationship or seeing each other in an adversarial sense, although clearly there are different theological beliefs, doctrines, that those are not going to go away. But the Quran doesn't ask Muslims to require other people to eradicate their beliefs. It really is talking about coming to terms with the fact that God has created a world in which there are people of many different viewpoints, worldviews, or religious traditions. And as far as relating to them, the energy should go into vying in the doing of good work. And I think that one of those kinds of things is to create an environment where religious freedom can be championed.
Thanks. And if we don't have any more questions, I do want to point out one other guest I saw slip in the back, who is a great resource for you here at Biola. If you'd stand up, Michael Muhlenberg, who is a PhD candidate and as of some hours ago, now ABD, and who is a real trailblazer and doing amazing work in Christian-Muslim relations. So if you're interested in Christian-Muslim relations, you've got a local ally here who's very knowledgeable and experienced, and I think also just an amazing witness to the beauty of Christ's love.
If you guys want to make a Muslim friend, on October 11th from 2 to 4 in Irvine. We're doing a mixer where Muslims come together, like my friends in Biola and many other Muslims will come together because they want a Christian friend. So if you're saying, I want a Muslim friend, I don't have one, you need some help, then please come. Or talk to the leaders of the campus student group of Muslim Christian understanding. They know everything that's going on. So, thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we have a Christian Muslim understanding ministry on campus if you guys are interested. And we're actually partnering with Interfaith Dialogue from my volunteer mosques, and we're actually serving refugee women next Saturday. So if you guys are interested, you can come talk to me or just come to the meeting on Monday night. Yeah.
Great. So what do you think? Do we have time for another question or?
Sure, yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
So this question is going to be about the martyrdom point you made.
Mhm.
So I see how meaning, marriage, and missions is all for the flourishing of human society. That makes sense. From what I gathered, you wanted to say that martyrdom was a negative, that you didn't want martyrdom. Okay, because my question was attached to, do you ever see martyrdom having a role in a healthy society?
No. I cannot imagine it being healthy that the price people are paying for their beliefs is death.
Yeah, I was just trying to see, because you seem to have a positive thing to say about free of them, and the martyrdom was a negative, so I found that was an odd.
Yes, and I guess I would say our common interest is a common shared view that this is a life or death issue, and that martyrdom is a way of expressing that life or death is going to be at stake in whether or not we can find ways to work this out. So with that, I think we're going to wrap it up. But I will probably be here for a few minutes before I head back to my hotel. And please stop by the table on the way out. There are resources for you to begin with task number 1 of maybe learn a little bit more. Thank you for your time tonight, and thank you, Biola.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.